Hello and welcome to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast, where each week, Pastor Jeff Cranston explores biblical theology that provides practical life applications in an understandable way. Thanks for joining us at the table. Let's get started.
Hello again, everybody. Jeff Cranston with you. Welcome back to Kitchen Table Theology. As we march on through talking to a number of people, leaders who are in various Christian denominations. If you haven't heard any of them yet, please go back. You don't have to go back very far to see who we have talked to and what denominations we've been looking into. But today we're really pleased to have Scott Pattison with us. And Scott is with the Global Methodist denomination. Now, I'm guessing many of us, that might be a new name to you. You might not have ever heard of the Global Methodist. Well, there's good reasons for that, because it's a fairly new denomination, but it's an exciting one, and it's been birthed with, I think, excellent foundations. And Scott is a conference superintendent. He lives in the States here in Indiana, and he oversees 4 different states with their various churches, and he'll tell us more about that. But Scott, welcome to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast.
Oh, it's good to be with you, Jeff. Thanks.
Well, let's just begin. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us where you're from, about your family, and maybe some educational background, and how you wound up with what you're doing now.
Yeah. So my dad was a pastor. He passed away, 6-7 years ago. I lost track of time. But so I grew up in a Methodist parsonage, and that was, kind of my life growing up. I accepted Christ as an early age. I remember hanging out with my friends that we would go to the religious education trailer that we would leave 5th grade, have to go over the fence because it couldn't sit on property. At least in Indiana, that was the case. And I always knew I was a part, accepted Christ. But my friends talked about a date, and it's like, I don't have a date. I just always knew, I grew up in the church. I've always, that just learned it. So one day during that religious education, I prayed the prayer and wrote a date down because I wanted a date. But I always say I just kind of slid into Christianity. It was an intentional decision, but it was just part of my life. And that's where I grew into. I've grown up in my faith. The summer before my junior year in high school at summer camp, we called it Senior High Institute at the time at Epworth Forest in Indiana. I was invited that day. We called it Decision Day. But during the small group gathering in that morning, Dale Linhart was leading the group, and he asked us to consider what it might be like to give our life to God, not just our heart for salvation, our soul for salvation, but what might that full-time Christian vocation decision. And so made a decision, kneeling down on that cement floor in that classroom, and the folded chair with the paint missing, and said, God, I want my life to whatever it is you have for me.
Wow. And
so made a decision into full-time Christian ministry, having no idea what that meant, just knew that was all in for me in that day, summer for my junior year. Went through our process of discernment called the candidacy process my senior year. And then I went to college. And so it was kind of on hold. So my undergraduate was an ecumenical movement, went to 3 different schools, but it was a psychology major. Met my wife, and my dad had moved from a town called 12 Mile to a town called 9 Mile. And true story, and met my wife there. And, as we got married, decided, hey, this is the person we're going to get married. Got married right after I graduated from undergraduate, and took on my first appointment, and that was 1985. And so I've been serving under appointment since 1985. It'll be 40 years this summer. And so I can remember the number of years I've been serving professionally as a pastor under appointment, and the number of years I got married, they're the same number, so I don't have to remember 2 different numbers and dates. And that's kind of been our life. Went to seminary when we were first couple of years of marriage was seminary. Our honeymoon was at Licensed to Preach School. I would recommend that to nobody. But the way our dates and everything worked out, I couldn't do the one in Indiana, and we'd already had our wedding date set up. And so we kind of laugh about that, but boy, it was, we had to get the license, to have the job, to have the house, to be in seminary. And so those were the first early years serving one of the smallest churches. My second appointment was downtown Tall Steeple, one of the largest churches. And over this journey, I've had the chance to serve about every size church, a small town, big city, multi-site, large staff. So I've had a lot of different experiences with that. And then did my Doctor of Ministry in Leadership Development, started that in 2006, finished it in 2011. And so that's kind of the little bit of background for, that brings us up to speed here. That we currently live in a town called Kokomo, Indiana, city of firsts, and it's just outside of Indianapolis, and we were here as things were moving at the time I was serving as the president of the Wesley Covenant Association, that was really started as a reform movement to just hold our denomination to biblical orthodoxy and to be that reform wing within the church. And that's kind of the journey, and the pivot was while I was here in town. And then I went full-time into this job, was doing 2 full-time jobs, what I got paid for, in the middle of all that transition that we can talk a little about later with the formation and everything. But then been full-time in this role since December 1, 2023. And we moved just outside the country. My wife's a city girl, but loving country living. And so that's kind of a little bit of who I am in a nutshell.
Now, one thing that we want to make clear, because it'll set us up for the rest of the podcast, you came up in all of that ministry and all those ministry years in the United Methodist Church. Is that correct?
Well, so in 1968, the United Methodist, or the Methodist and the Evangelical United Brethren merged. So my dad came out of the Methodist Evangelical Church. So that you have the Methodist Episcopal Church, and that has its own history with Methodist Episcopal North and South, the Protestant Methodist, the separating and coming back together in 1939. And so you have the Methodist strain, which was the English revival. And then you have the EUB, Evangelical United Brethren, and that's the group my wife had come out of. And that's really the Evangelical Association, and the Brethren, and that's more of that German pietist background. But in 1968 came together, formed the United Methodist Church. So yeah, Methodist then became United Methodist, and that's where I was called into ministry. That's where I have been ordained, full elder, 1990. And then have been serving as a United Methodist pastor up to recently, yes.
What we are learning in this podcast series on denominations, there's not one brand of Lutherans. There's not one brand of Baptists. There's not one brand of Presbyterians. There's not one brand of Methodists. There's not one brand of Anglicans or Episcopalians. There are various groups under the umbrella of the same name. So you coming up, as many did, in the United Methodist denomination, my mother did, so I have that on my mom's side of the family. Remember going to the church her parents went to, Timonium Methodist Church, and I just remember it being this big brick building with white columns, and it looked like all the Baptist churches, which is where we went. So I figured it was pretty much the same, except they had a few minor differences, but it was later on I realized, well, they're not minor differences. There's some significant differences. But you've come out of that, as have thousands of other people have recently come out of the United Methodist Church, and you have been instrumental in its infancy stages with the Global Methodist denomination. So that, I think that because of its newness, that would be not very familiar to a lot of our listeners, I think. So tell us how the Global Methodists got formed. Why start another denomination? what was going on in the United Methodist denomination to cause a great number of people to go, you know what, can't do this anymore. Let's start our own thing and let's go on from there. Can you tell us about that? I'm sure we've probably heard about it, but may not know hardly anything about what actually happened.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. Yeah, so really for us, it's been very similar to what John and Charles Wesley were doing. They were part of their group, the Anglican Church, and they were concerned with some of the practices, some of the different things that were going on. And so they really sought to reform their group. They never, ever thought they were going to start a new denomination, and really just wanted to reform their tribe. And so that was that really very similar journey to where we have been. And as you've said, and many know, not only with the strain of Methodists, there's every denominational strain has their family tree and different branches and different pieces with that. In rereading and revisiting some of our history, different times throughout the history of American Methodism, and really that's when the Methodist Church became a denomination, was when Dr. Koch and Francis Asbury came over to the United States and found that, okay, they really need some governance. And so John really wrestled, but said, I need to give them the freedom and ordain them as bishops or overseers, is really, the what they were, to guide this move that was happening. And so, John and Charles were like, hey, we're still working in England to reform, but this new branch over in the U.S. all of a sudden became a new denomination and began to grow. At that time, general superintending bishops writing, and as there were gatherings of Methodists called class meetings in different times, that they would then form them into circuits, and then the circuit writer would nurture the circuit. The bishop would be guiding all of the circuits and all of the different circuit writers and pastors together with a lot of that. And so out of that, as they've grown, different ones said, I can't stay with this version of it. There was, of course, in the United States, slavery played a part into the North-South and some of those different things. So a lot of different times. And so in many ways, this is just our moment in time where we said we're deeply concerned with the direction of that particular strain of Methodism. We tried when I left and moved into the Global Methodist Church, it was 54 years at the time, and just said, it's not the right alignment for me. Really, the people who were guiding much of the reform pieces, just said reform is not an option. And I don't want to go into a lot of the details, but in essence, it just goes, reform's not an option. And we've worked for reform. We tried for reform. The votes went the direction of reform, but it was just not going to work. And so we just said, we cannot stay. One of the expressions used with the United Methodist Church is the big tent. And as you know, with tents, it takes tension to hold it up. And so one of their expressions is, it's a big tent, there's room for everybody. Well, the tension just got so great. So we've been historically a part of the conservative side of the big tent seeking reform. And we just said, reform's not an option. And May 1, 2022, the Global Methodist was started because it was seen that reform was really not going to be an option. And so that's when the Methodist Church was formed, the conversation we had in our local congregation, and the pathway for us to choose our best alignment. And for us as a congregation, it was, what's the best alignment for us to do what God is calling us to do? And I even told our leadership in the conference, not everybody should go, but not everybody can stay. And right now we can't stay. And so I was one of four in the Global Methodist Church in Indiana as we were forming July 1, 2022. I was asked to be the global church organizer. And I said, I can organize 4 churches. And so there are a couple of different multi-sites and the like, but it's like, sure, we can kind of keep an eye on the formation and who can't stay and who's, going to be coming and aligning with us. And then that fall, I led the team and I created and led the team to create the annual conference, which is now the Great Lakes Conference. And Indiana, we were pretty far ahead. In about December, we had about 65 churches. So obviously we went going from 4 to 65, needing more organization and needing to form an annual conference. And we invited those around us, Wisconsin, Illinois. There were 2 conferences in Illinois and Michigan, and just said, hey, you guys want to do this together? And we talked and said, yeah. So we gathered in February of 23. And Bishop Jones was at that meeting and went around the table. Are you all okay with this? Just making sure everybody's on the same page. Nobody's trying to get one up on somebody else. And we all said, yeah, we're going to do this together. So from that point on, I had 3 standing meetings, and we met every week. And July 1, 2023, we were formed as a legal entity as the Great Lakes Conference with our 4-state area. And then we had our convening conference in October as a conference, and then we had our first annual conference, and then as a denomination, and different people across the United States, particularly in those days, it was United States. We are now seeing the rest of the world really begin to grow, but each one had a different time frame and a different path, and had the latitude to form the structure and the alignments that they had. And we had everybody at the table. Not everybody was officially out, but they were sitting at our table. And I said, if you're going to be with us, you're having voice and vote from day one. And so our 4 states, everybody had voice and vote as we were forming, because it's like, if we're doing this, we're doing this together. And it's been fun. It's been challenging. We've realized we were all part of a same denomination, but 5 former annual conferences, we all did it a little differently. So we've been shaping culture and building trust, earning trust, and a lot of that. So that's a little bit. Then my role, I was serving a church full time, and as well as leading the conference. And then they asked me to take the role of, at that time, what's called President Pro Tem, because we were just a legal entity. We hadn't decided what our structure was going to be. And so I was President Pro Tem, serving in the absence of a residential bishop. At that time, we had 2 bishops, Bishop Webb and Bishop Jones, that were bishing the world, literally. They divided up the world. And as we met in Costa Rica, we chose our organizational structure that we chose to go back. Before 1939, we had general superintending bishops. In 1939, went into jurisdictions and residential bishops. And we said, we really like the general superintending bishops that will defend the faith, teach the faith, and tie us together as a new expression of Methodism. We're working hard to be a movement again and not create another denomination, not create another institution. That has its own challenges, but we really are wanting to go back to that the freshest expression of who the people called Methodist have been, and really live into that as a vital expression of biblical Christianity with a Methodist flavor and understanding as we live this out in this new expression.
You said so much in that I kept making mental notes. I want to ask about that. I want to ask about this. I want to ask about that. Go back to a couple of names you mentioned, because I think it's important for our Kitchen Table Theology audience to equate the name John Wesley, Charles Wesley, with the Methodist movement. And for those of us in the footprint where I live maybe, we're about 20 miles from Savannah, Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And John Wesley still, there's still an influence. The boys' school that he started is still going strong, just south of Savannah, Epworth Conference Grounds and so forth. And of course, his ministry here in Savannah. And then Charles Wesley, I've often heard it said that very few remember any of John Wesley's sermons, but millions remember Charles Wesley's hymns. Yeah. So we have sung Charles Wesley's hymns for years. So Kitchen Table Theologian, in your mind, you want to equate the Wesleys and of course many other significant people with the Methodist movement. I did want to ask you too, Scott, when the decision was made, reform wasn't going to work. You came to that acknowledgement. Okay, time to start afresh, start a new movement. Were the differences that caused you all to make the decision, were they social issues? Were they theological issues? Or was there a mixture of both, do you think?
So where we wrestled with it, it was really how they understood the authority of Scripture, and then how that played out, which then are expressed in social issues. And so for us, the issue was biblical authority and orthodoxy, historical Christian faith. And we were concerned that there was a move away from biblical historic orthodoxy, the application of leaders that would just move the denomination in a direction away from that foundation. So for us, it was really biblical. We were concerned about some of the expressions, and many times that was the lead edge was, oh, this is about this or that. And for us, it's like, no, this is biblical authority and how we understand that, then which informs how we live that out. You're talking about Charles. Actually, what's interesting is Charles and John were both solid leaders. Charles is known more for his hymnody, but the thing that made the Methodist expression very unique was the experience of justifying faith. And so with Charles's hymnody really is singing the experience. So you got Watson Dodderidge, solid doctrine, solid theology. And so you definitely orthodoxy, right doctrine is correct, is needed. Right behavior is needed. And the thing that makes the Methodist expression unique, at least in that revival aspect, and I think for us today too, is do you have the right experience of justifying grace and then growing in that grace? So we call that sanctification. How do you grow up in grace? And so as the correct doctrine informs what are your guidelines? How do you live out your faith? The right experience is living that out, because now I'm saved through grace. I'm growing in that grace. That changes my behavior. And so some denominations are worried about correct doctrine, and that's not bad, but if you just have correct belief with no behavior or no experience, it's just information. And some denominations go, well, are you behaving correctly? And if you don't have good doctrine to guide how that behavior is, you don't have the right experience, then it's just behavior modification. And so the unique thing with the Wesley hymnody is we're singing our faith, but we're singing our experience of that justifying grace. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise. If I could only have 1,000 words to sing. So it's you see that very shift theologically in how it was lived out through the Wesleys.
That's beautifully put. I really appreciate you saying that, because everything ultimately comes down to biblical authority, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And the way that then influences our behavior, that's the Christian life.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you saying that as you did. So now the denomination's up and running. You have now churches that are, let's just say for the most part, at the very beginning, were functioning churches already. They own property, they own buildings. They were Methodist in name already, using just the word Methodist. So now they become Global Methodist churches. And I have a feeling I may know how you're going to answer this, but it'd be interesting to see if a couple of my kitchen table theologian friends and we walk into a Global Methodist church this Sunday, what kind of worship service would we experience?
Thanks so much for listening to the Kitchen Table Theology Podcast with Pastor Jeff Cranston. We're going to pause the interview right here, and we will pick it up next week. If you're enjoying the podcast, would you consider leaving a rating or review? We deeply appreciate your help in getting the word out so that others can hear about Kitchen Table Theology. You can check out today's episode notes and more at jeffcranston.com. You can also email us anytime at pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. As always, thanks are due to our friends at Low Country Community Church here in Bluffton, South Carolina, for making this podcast possible. Next week, we will be back. Pastor Jeff and Reverend Scott Pattison will continue their discussion about the Global Methodist Church. Until then, always remember that the real power of theology is not only knowing it, but applying it. Thanks for joining us at the table.